Welcome to Birthing a Colony. I'm Tamara Eastman, and I'm going to take you back to early Virginia, where we'll learn about the laws, superstitions, beliefs, and rituals surrounding midwifery and childbirth. Native American women in Virginia looked upon childbirth as a natural cycle in the cycle of life, rather than an illness as many of the colonists did. Captain John Smith marveled at how the Powhatan women suffered no illness or inconvenience during their pregnancy. The entire tribe looked after the woman during her pregnancy. Rituals and dances were performed in order to ensure a healthy baby would be born, and preparations were made for the big day. The Powhatan midwife prepared medicine with herbs to assist the mother in the delivery of her newborn, as well as control any pain she might endure. She utilized a variety of herbs and natural ingredients such as willow bark, juniper, elderflower, raspberry leaves, and black cohosh, which helped the uterus contract. When it came time to give birth, the expectant mother went into seclusion in a place that had been prepared for her. Oftentimes this was one of the yehakens, which was warmed with a fire. Food, water, and medicine was stored inside, and only one or two women would accompany the expectant mother. Men were refused admittance. This was a woman's domain only. The expectant mother gave birth in a squatting position. The baby dropped down on a mat, and the midwife cut the umbilical cord, cleaned the infant, and swaddled it in furs or skins. The new mother rested for a couple of days after giving birth, remaining in seclusion, and then she would return to her duties within a few days. She would carry her baby on a cradle board, wrapped in skins, which could be conveniently hung from a tree branch while she continued doing her work. Men of the planter and gentry classes seemed very aloof about the births of their children. Diaries and journals were kept by them, and they indicated that the baby was an afterthought to many of them. They would speak of all sorts of goings-on at the plantation, such as slaves that had been bought and sold, crops that were being harvested, or social goings-on in the home. And they might mention, "And my wife was delivered of an infant son this day." But that would be the only mention of it. Women didn't wear maternity clothes in the 18th century. They simply had drawstrings sewn into the waistline of their skirts, and they would let them out as their pregnancies progressed. For upper-class women, childbearing was an opportunity to socialize and present her child to the public. Women of the gentry class had slaves to do their domestic chores, so they were given all the time that they needed in order to recuperate from the delivery. A slave nanny would bring the baby into the room for the guests to view, and then take it back to the nursery. Visitors came, and luncheons and dinners were hosted, and gifts were brought. The gentry class usually handed their babies off to a slave to wet nurse the infants. The slave mother usually had given birth to an infant of her own, but she was required to feed the master's children first, and often had to neglect her own infant. Women of the lower classes, however, struggled through their pregnancies with domestic chores and had to return to their work soon after giving birth. There really was no maternity leave for them. The only domestic help they might have might be daughters who were old enough to help care for the infant and younger children or help out with chores. African slave women were worked hard throughout their pregnancies. They were also punished. In fact, whipping was carried out by digging a hole in the ground for the expectant mother to lay her stomach in, and then the whipping was carried out. After giving birth, the new mother was given perhaps a day to rest, a few more if there had been complications, and then she was expected to return to her duties. Some new slave mothers were sold at auction and ordered to give up their babies. One slave woman named Fanny was ordered at auction to hand her infant over to another slave woman, as her new master didn't want the baby. Fanny held the infant up and threatened to kill it rather than abandon it, if she was not allowed to bring it with her. Some slave women, especially those who had been made pregnant by their masters, performed a subtle form of slave resistance by aborting their fetuses. Their message was fairly clear. I'll be damned if I'll give that man another baby so he can profit from its slavery. Many of these slave women were well aware of herbs, such as pennyroyal, that help bring about an abortion. They'd simply boil a tea infused with the herb and drink it, and if it were discovered that she'd expelled the fetus, she'd simply state that she had suffered a miscarriage. Some women gave birth on a birthing stool, in which they would sit upright and the child would pass through an opening in the bottom of the stool. Midwives of the period, as well as doctors, could also utilize a variety of tools. One such was called a crochet, and if the baby's head were too large to pass through the birth canal, this was used as a last resort. A great number of superstitions surrounded births. Women feared if they looked upon horrible specters or were frightened by something during pregnancy that it could cause marks to appear on their baby. Some women were even cautioned against staring at the moon during their pregnancy for fear their child would be born demented. It was thought that a draft of any kind was detrimental to the mother and baby. The entire birthing room would be sealed up, all of the windows and doors shut, the keyhole stopped up, cracks under the door sealed up with cloth. A roaring fire was lit in the fireplace, and the expectant mother was buried under a mountain of blankets. The room became a virtual sweat lodge. The midwife poured liquor down the expectant mother's throat, along with herbal teas and various concoctions that she made up to assist in the delivery and help with pain management. Childbirth for women of any class was painful and frightening, but the women of the upper classes received far more attention than any other. In many cases, the midwife was a slave. However, some of the upper class women hired European midwives as well. The midwife and all the other women in the room worked to keep the mother comfortable as nature took its course. When both mother and child came through the birthing process unscathed, it was cause for celebration. Regardless of their social class, childbirth was a dangerous experience for any woman. In early colonial Virginia, several cases of childbirth ended with the mother dying as a result of hemorrhaging, a severe infection, or simply from dehydration and exhaustion. The death rate for women in colonial Virginia was about 1 in 8. Half a dozen women in one town dying in childbirth in a year was not unusual. Sadly, the rate of death for infants was even higher. In some cases, both the mother and child died. Families were large then, because at least half of the children would die before age 5 in many cases, and there were so many things that could kill them. Some men in colonial Virginia were married as many as 4 times because their previous wives had died in childbirth. The infant mortality rate was very high as well. Out of every 1,000 births in early colonial Virginia, as many as 200 babies died. Persons who were bound to Virginia as indentured servants were required to be single. Indentured servants were forbidden to marry anybody during their period of indenture. However, several young indentured women became pregnant while in service. In fact, the rate of illegitimate births among female indentures became 3 times higher in Virginia than among the working class in England. The young woman was usually arrested and forced to make a public confession of having committed this immoral sin. However, several of these young women had been raped by their own masters. And their masters, most of whom were married members of upper-class gentry with a reputation to protect, would deny such claims against them.
Can you prove
Sir, this woman is nothing but a liar. Absolute liar.
You know it.
She cannot speak the truth. There's no way this woman can speak the truth. Please continue to sentence.
If you have evidence of this alleged crime, I will be happy to hear it. Without evidence, the court cannot enter it into judgment.
But there was no one to see. He took me against my will. You know, when I was working, you know, his wife was gone. He was there.
The law limits me. If you have no witnesses, I can't find any differently.
You've got to believe me. Adulteress.
The court usually sided with the landed gentry and punished the young woman. Some were whipped at public whipping posts and given more years added on to their indenture, and some were imprisoned. To add insult to injury, the master could sue the woman he had raped for the added expense of having to care for her as well as her illegitimate child, putting the woman in debt to him for life. In addition, the court could also fine her, and she would end up owing so much money that she'd never be released from her indenture. In early colonial Virginia, any number of crimes could send someone to the gallows, especially those from the lower classes. The concept of a penitentiary system had not been developed yet, so jails were just holding cells where you would stay until a sentence could be carried out, anything from a public whipping to execution. Many women in these situations would claim to be pregnant. In other words, they would plead their bellies, and they would be sent to the jail where an examination would take place from a midwife to determine if they really were pregnant, and if so, they would remain in the jail until they could give birth, because it was against the law to execute a pregnant woman. Once the female inmate gave birth, she could be dragged off to the gallows within hours, usually within a day or two, and hanged. Her newborn was taken from her, and if her family was not located, the infant was turned over to an orphanage, where he stayed until he was old enough to be sent to orphan court, where he'd be indentured out in order to earn his keep. The child would live in an orphanage until he or she was old enough to be sent away to live with a family as a servant. About once a year in the colony, something called an orphan court was held. Either that or the orphanages themselves could just sell the children outright. I'm Tamara Eastman. Thank you for joining us as we have witnessed the joys and hardships of birthing a colony.